Everyone, thank you for watching this presentation. I'm Michelle from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and today I'll be presenting our study on cultural differences in the perception and response to criticism in Singapore, Italy, and USA. To start off with a brief background, criticism can be defined as negative evaluative feedback received from other people in social interactions, and can be considered a form of hurtful communication. Hurt or social pain has been conceptualized as a feeling arising in response to emotional injury. Most characterizations of hurt share three common qualities. 1. It's an interpersonal phenomenon involving the words or actions of others. 2. It's emotionally wounding. And 3. It involves vulnerability, which means that it occurs in the context of a valued relationship and a chance of recurring hurt once the person has been hurt before. Criticism also affects mental health. Excessive criticism has been associated with negative individual outcomes and plays a role in the development and recurrence of psychopathologies such as depression and schizophrenia. The link between criticism and relapse or psychopathology is supported by the extensive empirical research conducted on the expressed emotion construct, of which criticism is the most important element. For example, schizophrenic patients living with a family member who is critical of them have a significantly higher risk of relapse. Culture is one factor that may influence the perception and response to criticism. The expression, perception, and consequences of criticism may vary across different cultures and ethnic groups. There are different social cultural norms and expectations for the kinds of behavior that warrant criticism as well as the general levels of criticism. For example, studies have found that Japanese people tend to exhibit self-critical tendencies compared to Europeans and Americans, such as accepting negative self-relevant information more readily. In addition, US Americans responded more assertively to criticism compared to Asian counterparts. Between different cultures, there are also different norms regarding emotional and social competence and the beliefs surrounding one's emotions and their expression. Firstly, there is cultural variability in emotional experience, as culture constrains how emotions are felt and expressed in different cultural contexts. Culture has a role in shaping the ways people should feel in certain situations and how emotions are expressed. The environment, social, and cultural situation all influence emotion. A consistent finding has been that Western culture is related to high arousal emotions, and Eastern culture is related to low arousal emotions. People tend to experience the emotions considered to be ideal in their culture. Secondly, emotion understanding and emotion regulation are more culture specific. Cultural factors are critical in informing the effectiveness of emotion regulation strategies, and individuals engage in and benefit when emotion regulation strategies consistent with cultural goals and self-concepts are employed. Findings from previous studies also showed that cultures emphasizing social order and hierarchy had a greater tendency for emotion suppression and showed positive correlations between emotion suppression and emotion reappraisal. Specifically, individualistic cultures tend to find cognitive reappraisal more effective in managing negative affect, whereas collectivistic cultures tend to display emotion suppression as it mitigates the impact of negative emotional states on others by reducing the risk of disrupting group harmony. In summary, culture is inextricably linked to the expression, experience, and regulation of emotion, and the salient differences between cultures in these various facets of emotion highlight the importance of examining how different cultures perceive and respond to criticism. There are also cultural differences in the use and expression of praise and criticism by parents. Western parenting is typically characterized by parental warmth, indicated by verbal and emotional expressions such as kissing and praising, whereas Asian parenting tends to be less likely to show outward affection and verbal expressions of love, instead conveying affection through instrumental support, devotion, close monitoring, and support for education. In addition, it has been suggested that cultural differences in parental responses to children's success and failures may be responsible for how children themselves respond to success and failures. In Asian cultures, an emphasis is placed on self-improvement, with effort being an integral part of this self-improvement enhancement and the possession of positive attributes. Hence, Asian parents tend to downplay children's success and highlight failure, and conversely, American parents may highlight children's success and downplay failure. For example, American mothers provide positive feedback in order to fulfill their role in protecting and building children's self-esteem, whereas Taiwanese mothers deem self-esteem to be unimportant and may even interfere with a child's receptivity to correction from others. This differential employment of positive feedback by parents of different cultures further highlights the role of cultural differences in parenting practices in influencing individual differences in the perception and response to criticism. The present study aims to investigate the relationship between culture and the perception and response to criticism and samples from 3 different countries, Singapore, Italy, and USA. Including samples from these 3 different countries provides insight into cultural differences in the perception and response to criticism, which is a pertinent variable to examine in light of the cultural forces underlying prevalence and employment of criticism in social interactions and parenting, as well as those shaping parenting practices. For this presentation, we will be focusing on the hypothesis there would be cultural differences in perception and response to criticism between the 3 different countries. Specifically, due to differences between individualistic and collectivistic cultures, it is expected that USA, which has a more individualistic culture, would show more negative perceptions and reactions to criticism compared to countries with more collectivistic cultures such as Singapore. Participants from the Singaporean and Italian sample were recruited through a psychology undergraduate course and compensated with course credits. Participants from the American sample were recruited from Amazon Mechanical Turk and received monetary compensation. All participants answered questions regarding their demographic information and completed the following scales on a questionnaire hosted on Qualtrics. Principal components analysis was then conducted on the measures of perception and response to criticism, being the sensitivity to criticism, attributions of criticism, and perceived criticism. Using the derived principal components, stepwise regression for each principal component was conducted by inserting the following predictors into the model: PBI care and overprotection for mothers and fathers, relationship type of the source of criticism, country of origin, and gender. Country was found to be a significant predictor of PC1, which is indicative of a tendency to perceive criticism as destructive, and PC3, which is indicative of general levels of criticism perceived in an individual's social environment. This result suggests that there is a higher tendency to perceive criticism as destructive in USA compared to Singapore and Italy, and a lower general level of criticism perceived in one's social environment in the USA compared to Singapore and Italy. There were differences between countries in terms of the tendency to perceive criticism as destructive, where US Americans showed a higher tendency to do so. A possible explanation for this finding is the difference in communication styles between US Americans compared to Singaporeans and Italians, in terms of the differences in communication styles between individualistic and collectivistic cultures. Many studies have shown that a low-context communication style is characteristic of individualistic cultures, where assertive behavior is viewed as efficacious and competent, compared to the high-context communication style, which is characteristic of collectivistic cultures, where competence is manifested through maintenance of faith and regard for interpersonal harmony. In addition, a previous study showed that US Americans were more likely to engage in active criticism. Notably, given that criticism in Americans is usually expressed with sarcasm, anger, and insultingly, it can be expected that there would be a higher tendency to perceive criticism as destructive. On the other hand, the Japanese sample in this study were more likely to engage in passive criticism, where they more frequently reported that they would attempt not to show dissatisfaction, express dissatisfaction to a third person, and express such dissatisfaction non-verbally, ambiguously, and humorously. Hence, differences in communication styles could have a role in how criticism is expressed in different cultures, and consequently, differences in the expression of criticism could possibly explain differences in the tendency to perceive criticism as destructive across cultures. Another possible explanation for the observed difference between countries in the tendency to perceive criticism as destructive is a difference in in-group-out-group distinction between cultures. The in-group-out-group distinction has been found to be particularly important in collectivistic cultures, where members of collectivistic cultures exhibit differentiation according to group membership more sharply than members of individualistic cultures, and group membership is stronger and more prominent for members of collectivistic cultures. A significant body of work has looked at group-directed criticism and found that criticism from in-group members is generally received more positively than criticism from out-group members, even when the content of the criticism is identical, an effect termed the intergroup sensitivity effect. The cause of the ISE has been posited to be mediated by an attributional bias, where in-group members are attributed to have more constructive motives than out-group critics in accordance with existing literature, indicating that in-group members tend to be trusted more than out-group members, and more favorable outcomes are expected from in-group compared to out-group members. As such, members of collectivistic cultures with a stronger in-group-out-group distinction will be more likely to demonstrate in-group bias and trust towards in-group members, resulting in more constructive motives being attributed to criticism received. On the other hand, members of individualistic cultures will be less likely to attribute constructive motives towards criticism from others, and be more likely to attribute destructive motives towards criticism instead. Hence, this could possibly explain a higher tendency to perceive criticism as destructive, observed in the USA sample, which has an individualistic culture, compared to the Singapore sample, which has a collectivistic culture. While we have investigated samples from 3 different countries in the present study, it is important to note that even within the broad categories of the commonly employed individualistic versus collectivistic framework, individual countries classified under either category are still characterized by idiosyncrasies that make them distinct from one another. For example, intra-regions of Asia should be investigated for their distinctness, given that Asian cultures tend to nurture distinct conceptions of individuality, incurring from the fundamental relatedness between people. More specifically, a study found significant differences in measures of both intrapersonal and interpersonal emotional competence between Asian countries, namely Myanmar, Japan, China, and Bangladesh. Furthermore, acculturation of parenting practices in migrant populations is another area that can be studied. In migrant families, both parents and children are exposed to values of the host culture of the country that they have migrated to, and their original culture continues to influence family values and norms, and new behaviors that are developed in the context of the country they have migrated to. Hence, the present study can be replicated in more countries, and comparisons can also be made between migrant populations to local populations in order to gain a more holistic perspective of the nature of criticism in social interactions across different cultures. Thank you for listening to my presentation. You can contact me at this email if you have questions about the study.